I'm Lise and welcome to the Inner Child series on YouTube. This is not a hypnotherapy session, but it is me reading a children's story, ideal for bedtime stories for kids and also to help adults get in touch with their inner child. So today I'm going to read Mr. Greedy by Roger Hargreaves. Are you ready? Mr. Greedy liked to eat. In fact, Mr. Greedy loved to eat. The more he ate, the fatter he became. And the trouble was, the fatter he became, the more hungry he became. The more hungry he became, the more he ate. And the more he ate, the fatter he became. And so it went on. Mr. Greedy lived in a house that looked rather like himself. It was a roly-poly sort of a house. One morning, Mr. Greedy awoke rather earlier than usual. He'd been dreaming about food as usual, and that made him wake up and feel hungry as usual. So Mr. Greedy got up, went downstairs and ate an enormous breakfast. This is what Mr. Greedy had. Toast, 2 slices. Cornflakes, 1 packet. Milk, 1 bottle. Sugar, 1 bowlful. Toast, 3 slices. Eggs boiled, 3 slices. Toast, 4 slices. Butter, 1 dish. Marmalade, 1 pot. And when he had finished his big, enormous breakfast, Mr. Greedy sat back in his chair and smiled, a very satisfied smile. And he thought, oh, that was a delicious breakfast, he thought to himself. Oh, now I wonder what would be nice to have for lunch. He decided to order and work up a nice big appetite for his lunch so he could go for a walk. That morning Mr. Greedy walked and walked and walked, and then he discovered a cave. That's funny, he thought. Well, I don't remember seeing that before. Mr. Greedy, being a very curious sort of a fella, decided to explore. He entered the dark cave. Inside, he discovered some giant steps leading upwards. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of a fella, decided to climb them. They were very steep and very difficult to climb. But with much huffing and puffing, Mr. Greedy climbed up and up. At the top of the stairs, Mr. Greedy came to a door. It was, without a doubt, the biggest door that Mr. Greedy had ever seen. But Mr. Greedy, again, being a curious sort of a fella, decided to find out what was on the other side of that door. So Mr. Greedy squeezed himself through the crack in the door. There before him was an amazing sight. The biggest room in the world. The floor was as big as a field. The table in the middle and the floor was as big as a house. And the chairs around it were as high as trees. Mr. Greedy felt very, very small. And he sniffed. Coming from somewhere up on the top of that gigantic table was a most delicious foody smell that Mr. Greedy had ever smelled. Mr. Greedy sniffed again, then decided he must get up on that table. So he began to climb one leg up on the enormous chair. It was very difficult, and it took him a long time, but eventually, Mr. Greedy stood on the table, and everything was larger than life. The salt and pepper pots were both as big as a pillar box. There was a bowl of fruit on the table, and Mr. Greedy tried to lift one of the oranges up. Mr. Greedy, being Mr. Greedy, took a bite out of one of the apples. And he looked around. Over the other side of the table stood the source of that most delicious smell. A huge, enormous, gigantic plate. Oh, of sausages, the size of pillows. A huge, gigantic, colossal potatoes, the size of beach balls. And huge, gigantic, colossal peas, the size of cabbages. Mr. Greedy hurried across the table towards the plate, and being very greedy, he began to eat. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the plate. Suddenly, Mr. Greedy found himself, picked himself up. Oh my goodness! He was picked up by a giant hand looking into the eyes of a real-life giant. "And who," thundered the giant, "are you?" Mr. Greedy was frightened. He couldn't manage to squeak his name. Mr. Greedy," he squeaked. The giant laughed. As loud as thunder. "Greedy by name, and greedy by nature. Well, I think, Mr. Greedy, you need to be taught a lesson." And what a lesson it was. The giant made Mr. Greedy eat up everything on the plate. And when he had finished, Mr. Greedy felt so ill. He was going to burst at any minute. "Now," said the giant in a much quieter voice, "do you promise never to be greedy again?" Oh, yes, yes, Mr. Greedy promised. "I promise." "Very well," said the giant. "Then I'll let you go." Mr. Greedy climbed down from the table and went down the door feeling very fat and very miserable. And do you know what? From this day and that day, Mr. Greedy has never eaten so much again. He kept his promise. And do you know something else as well? Mr. Greedy doesn't look like he used to look anymore. He looks rather slim, which I think suits him a lot. And if you know anybody who is as greedy as Mr. Greedy, well, do you know what you should tell them, don't you? Beware of giants. Thank you.